The summer of 1942 saw the German war machine pushing ever deeper into Soviet territory. Riding the momentum of Operation Barbarossa, Hitler launched Operation Blue, aiming to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus and cut off the Volga River, a critical Soviet supply route. Stalingrad, a bustling industrial city on the western bank of the Volga, suddenly became a target of immense strategic and symbolic importance. Capturing it would not only cripple Soviet transport and industry, but also strike at the very name of their leader, Joseph Stalin. The German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, advanced with precision across the open Russian plains, their mechanized units rolling over sparse resistance. Yet even in retreat, Soviet forces displayed remarkable tenacity. West of the Don River, a small division of just 3,000 men managed to stall two entire German divisions for weeks. Cut off, starving, and low on ammunition, they refused to surrender. Their commander orchestrated a daring nighttime breakout, leading the 2,000 surviving soldiers through marshes and under darkness across the Don, a feat that both frustrated the Germans and inspired the Soviet command. By late August, German units reached the outskirts of Stalingrad, and on August 23rd, the 16th Panzer Division arrived at the northern bank of the Volga, officially beginning the siege. The Luftwaffe then unleashed a catastrophic bombing campaign, sending over 1,000 aircraft to reduce the city to rubble. Explosions flattened industrial areas, residential blocks, and schools alike, leaving streets choked with debris and smoke. In just the first week, estimates suggest that as many as 40,000 civilians perished. Ironically, the destruction created a labyrinthine battlefield that would eventually stall the German advance and turn the city into a trap for the attackers. Stalingrad's civilians were trapped. Stalin's order, number 227, forbade retreat, and local populations were required to endure the bombing and fight for every building alongside the Red Army. Factories, warehouses, and apartment blocks became defensive positions, while the rubble itself provided cover for snipers and small units. By late August, the stage was set for one of the most brutal urban battles in history, a grinding fight that would transform the city into a frozen graveyard and test the limits of human endurance. Once the German advance reached Stalingrad, their blitzkrieg tactics became almost useless. The city, reduced to rubble by relentless air raids, created a maze of shattered buildings, twisted steel, and collapsed streets. Combat quickly degenerated into what soldiers called the Rattenkrieg, or Rat War, a brutal struggle fought room by room, floor by floor, and sometimes through sewers. Artillery and tanks, once dominant in open fields, were largely ineffective in the confined ruins. Soviet General Vasily Chuikov implemented a daring strategy. His soldiers would hug the enemy, staying as close as possible to German positions. By doing so, Soviet troops neutralized the advantage of German air strikes and artillery, forcing the attackers to risk hitting their own men if they fired. Small storm groups of 20 to 50 men conducted surprise attacks using submachine guns, explosives, and captured weapons to ambush German units in basements, alleys, and ruined apartment complexes. These tactics created constant uncertainty and exhaustion for the invaders. One of the most famous episodes of this urban hell was Pavlov's house. Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and his platoon held a fortified 4-story apartment building overlooking a key city square for 58 days. Despite repeated German assaults, the defenders used sandbags, mines, and machine guns to repel attacks, turning the structure into an impregnable fortress. Their resistance became a symbol of Soviet tenacity, showing that even a handful of soldiers could inflict massive delays on elite German forces. Street fighting intensified as both sides struggled for control of every factory, school, and warehouse. Snipers dominated rooftops, while soldiers tunneled through a rubble to surprise their enemies. The winter of 1942 was approaching, but the battle raged on, with constant casualties, freezing temperatures, and the psychological toll of fighting amid collapsed buildings and burning streets. By mid-October, the Germans had gained little ground despite weeks of heavy fighting, and the front lines were measured not in kilometers but in meters, a testament to the extraordinary resilience of Stalingrad's defenders. While the Germans were locked in a grueling street fight, Soviet commanders were quietly preparing one of the most decisive maneuvers of the war. Marshal Georgy Zhukov orchestrated Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive aimed not at the city itself, but at the vulnerable flanks held by Axis allies. The northern and southern approaches were defended mainly by Romanian and Italian units, Poorly equipped and spread thin across hundreds of kilometers of open terrain, Zhukov had meticulously assembled more than 1 million soldiers, nearly 900 tanks, and over 13,000 artillery pieces, all concealed until the moment of attack. On November 19, 1942, Soviet artillery and rocket barrages erupted at dawn, devastating the Romanian defenses. The noise was deafening, shaking the frozen earth and leaving gaps for mechanized units to pour through. Soviet tank columns, reinforced by infantry, pushed rapidly across the snow-covered plains, creating chaos behind enemy lines. By November 20th, the southern pincer smashed through Italian positions while the northern thrust had broken Romanian lines, leaving the German Sixth Army dangerously exposed. The maneuver's brilliance lay in timing and precision. Zhukov's forces encircled the Axis troops at Kalash. By November 23rd, effectively trapping approximately 250,000 German, Hungarian, and Romanian soldiers in a massive pocket of ice and death. Communication lines were severed and supply routes vanished under relentless Soviet pressure. German commanders quickly realized the scale of the encirclement. But with winter closing in and the Luftwaffe unable to provide sufficient supplies, the Sixth Army's situation became increasingly desperate. Inside the pocket, soldiers faced dwindling food, freezing temperatures, and mounting casualties. Medical supplies were minimal and infections spread rapidly among the wounded. Despite desperate attempts to hold their lines, morale began to collapse. Even elite German units could not overcome the combination of encirclement, harsh weather, and relentless Soviet attacks. Operation Uranus had turned the tide at Stalingrad, transforming the battle from a brutal city siege into a catastrophic trap for the Axis forces and setting the stage for the final crushing phase of the fight. Once the encirclement was complete, the trapped German Sixth Army found itself in what soldiers grimly called the cauldron. Cut off from reinforcements and supplies, the army faced an impossible situation. Hitler ordered Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus to hold the city at all costs, promising that the Luftwaffe would supply the besieged troops entirely by air. In reality, the German Air Force was unable to deliver more than a fraction of the necessary rations and ammunition. Even at its peak, the daily airlift provided only about 1/3 of what the army needed to survive. Winter intensified the suffering. Temperatures in the Stalingrad region plummeted well below -20 degrees Celsius, freezing equipment and men alike. Soldiers without proper winter gear suffered frostbite within hours, and malnutrition weakened them further. Horses, dogs, and even rats became sources of last resort food, but starvation continued to claim thousands of lives. Medical conditions deteriorated rapidly, and disease spread unchecked in crowded makeshift shelters and foxholes. German morale collapsed under the relentless pressure. Units broke down, and soldiers abandoned positions in search of warmth or food, often being cut down in the chaos. Paulus had attempted to request permission to break out, but Hitler's insistence on holding Stalingrad made any retreat impossible. In December, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm, a relief attempt, but Soviet defenses held firm just miles from the encircled troops. Every failed rescue deepened the despair inside the cauldron. The trapped army faced constant attacks from Soviet artillery and sniper fire, while the surrounding steppe was littered with the bodies of men and animals alike. Ammunition was scarce, and even artillery became ineffective as the soldiers lacked shells to fire. By January 1943, conditions were catastrophic. Soldiers were freezing, starving, and falling by the thousands, with no hope of relief. The once powerful Sixth Army had become a hollow, desperate force, a shadow of its former strength. The stage was set for the final surrender, a conclusion that would mark one of the bloodiest chapters in human history. By late January 1943, the trapped German forces were a shadow of their former selves. Operation Ring, the final Soviet assault, began on January 23rd, targeting the remaining pockets of resistance in the devastated city. Exhausted, starving, and encircled, German units offered only minimal resistance. Friedrich Paulus, recently promoted to Field Marshal in a symbolic gesture by Hitler, realized the futility of further fighting and surrendered on January 31st. 2 days later, on February 2nd, the last German troops laid down their arms, marking the official end of the battle. The human cost was almost unimaginable. Estimates placed total casualties, including dead, wounded, and missing, at over 1 million for both sides combined. Among the 91,000 German soldiers captured, only about 5,000 would survive captivity to see Germany again. Soviet losses were equally staggering, with hundreds of thousands killed or wounded, including countless civilians caught in the relentless urban warfare. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, and the city of Stalingrad itself was almost completely destroyed. Beyond the physical destruction, the psychological impact was profound. The myth of German invincibility was shattered, delivering a decisive blow to Axis morale on the Eastern Front. Stalingrad became a symbol of Soviet resilience and strategic brilliance, demonstrating how determination, tactical ingenuity, and the harsh Russian winter could combine to stop even the most powerful military force. The Red Army's victory marked a turning point in the Second World War, shifting the initiative to the Soviets and setting them on a path that would ultimately lead to Berlin. The lessons of Stalingrad extend far beyond military strategy. It showed the devastating cost of urban warfare, the dangers of overextension, and the human toll of total war. The frozen rubble of Stalingrad would serve as a reminder of sacrifice, endurance, and the horrifying scale of modern conflict for generations to come. Today, memorials and preserved ruins honor both the soldiers and civilians who endured unimaginable hardship, ensuring that the story of Stalingrad remains one of history's most haunting lessons. The story of the Spanish flu pandemic begins far from Spain, most likely on the wind-swept plains of Kansas in March of 1918. In Haskell County and at Fort Riley, a massive U.S. Army training camp, a new strain of influenza emerged among soldiers preparing to head to Europe. Initially, it seemed almost ordinary. A sore throat, fever, chills, and body aches. Within a week, over 500 men at Fort Riley were ill, but this first wave was surprisingly mild and most recovered quickly. For the first half of 1918, the flu did not appear significantly more dangerous than a typical seasonal influenza, yet the timing was perfect for the virus to spread. Crowded transport ships carried tens of thousands of soldiers across the Atlantic to Europe, turning military vessels and trenches into incubators. Once the virus reached the battlefields, it spread with unprecedented speed, infecting roughly 900,000 German troops and crippling French and British forces, while military planners struggled to maintain operational strength. Governments kept news of the disease largely secret, fearing that public panic would undermine morale. Meanwhile, Spain, which remained neutral in World War I, reported openly on the outbreak in its cities. Newspapers in Madrid, Barcelona, and other towns chronicled the illness and rising death toll, leading international readers to mistakenly believe the flu had originated there. That perception gave the pandemic its lasting name, the Spanish flu. By the summer of 1918, the initial wave seemed to subside, lulling the world into a false sense of security. Yet the virus was mutating quietly, adapting to infect more efficiently and become deadlier. This first wave, mild as it seemed, set the stage for the second, far more lethal wave that would erupt in the fall and transform a global influenza outbreak into one of the deadliest pandemics in recorded history. By the fall of 1918, the virus returned, far deadlier than the first wave. This second wave had mutated into a highly virulent strain, capable of killing even the healthiest adults between the ages of 20 and 40. Unlike normal influenza, which mainly threatens the very young and the elderly, this strain triggered extreme immune responses in strong bodies, causing what modern scientists now identify as a cytokine storm. Infected individuals often develop severe pneumonia within days, and their lungs would fill with fluid, leaving them gasping for oxygen. The symptoms were gruesome and fast-acting. Victims developed dark, mahogany-colored patches on their skin as their bodies suffocated, while coughing fits could produce blood-tinged mucus. Hospitals quickly became overwhelmed, unable to keep pace with the sudden surge of cases. By October of 1918, the United States experienced its deadliest month in history, with an estimated 195,000 deaths. Life expectancy across the nation dropped nearly 12 years, an unprecedented collapse in public health. Cities reacted in very different ways with strikingly different results. Philadelphia, ignoring warnings, held a massive parade to sell war bonds, drawing hundreds of thousands of people into close quarters. Within days, every hospital bed in the city was full, and thousands perished in the weeks that followed, with nearly 13,000 deaths recorded. Meanwhile, St. Louis implemented early and strict measures. Schools, theaters, and public gatherings were closed, and Masks became mandatory in public. The city's death rate was just 1/8 of Philadelphia's, demonstrating that social distancing and quarantine, though primitive by today's standards, were highly effective. Without vaccines or antiviral treatments, the world had few tools to fight the disease. Pneumonia and other secondary infections claimed countless additional lives. The second wave would ultimately leave tens of millions dead worldwide, showing the terrifying power of a rapidly mutating virus in a globally connected population. This wave transformed the Spanish flu from a regional epidemic into a full-blown pandemic, one that would leave scars on nearly every continent. The second wave of the Spanish flu did not remain confined to Europe or North America. It spread across the globe with terrifying speed. Troop movements, international shipping, and expanding railway networks acted as highways for the virus, carrying it to every inhabited continent. Remote regions that had little contact with outsiders were not spared. In Alaska, entire indigenous villages were devastated, leaving children orphaned, and communities fractured. In parts of the Arctic and Pacific Islands, mortality rates reached catastrophic levels because populations had little prior exposure to influenza. India was particularly hard hit. Estimates suggest that at least 12 million people died there, representing roughly 5% of the country's population at the time. Urban centers across Europe and the United States struggled to cope with the sheer scale of the outbreak. In New York City, approximately 33,000 people died, while hospitals, morgues, and funeral homes were stretched beyond capacity. The total death toll in the United States eventually reached around 675,000. Globally, the death toll was staggering. Most historians agree that at least 50 million people died worldwide, with some estimates rising as high as 100 million. To put that in perspective, World War I, which had lasted 4 years and involved dozens of countries, had claimed roughly 20 million lives. The pandemic moved faster than any war, killing more people in a single year than the Great War did in 4. Hospitals were completely overwhelmed, with shortages of doctors, nurses, and medical supplies. Makeshift wards and temporary hospitals were established in schools, churches, and other public buildings. Mass graves were dug in cities around the world to manage the sheer volume of corpses. In many places, the sound of carts transporting the dead became a normal part of daily life, a grim reminder that this was not a distant battle, but a war waged inside homes and neighborhoods everywhere. After the devastating peak of the fall of 1918, the Spanish flu did not disappear immediately. A third wave struck in the winter and spring of 1919, less deadly than the second, but still claiming countless lives worldwide. Communities already weakened by previous infections saw renewed outbreaks, particularly in Europe and Asia, where healthcare systems were exhausted and malnutrition was widespread. In some regions, mortality remained high because hospitals and clinics were still overwhelmed, and public health resources were scarce. By 1920, a fourth, weaker wave flickered in certain areas, including parts of Europe and Africa. This wave largely affected children and those who had not been exposed in previous waves, but it marked the final major spread of the pandemic. Across all waves, it is estimated that at least 1/3 of the global population, around 500 million people, were infected. The pandemic left a profound impact on societies, economies, and public health systems, with some regions taking years to recover fully. Despite the staggering scale, the Spanish flu largely faded from public memory for decades. Unlike World War I, which had defined heroes, clear battles, and a visible enemy, the flu was invisible and indiscriminate. Ordinary people suffered in private homes, and many survivors carried trauma too personal to share. Monuments and commemorations were rare, and newspapers quickly shifted focus to post-war recovery and the celebrations of the Roaring Twenties. It wasn't until much later, with modern scientific study and the reconstruction of the virus in laboratories in the early 21st century, that the true scale and lethality of the pandemic were fully understood. Researchers recognized it as one of the deadliest events in human history, a stark lesson in how rapidly a novel pathogen can spread across a connected world. The Spanish flu left societies grappling with grief, lost populations, and the realization that even in the modern era, humanity could be vulnerable to nature's microscopic forces. By the end of the pandemic, the world had been brought to its knees. Estimates suggest that at least 50 million people died, and some figures indicate the toll may have reached 100 million. Cities, villages, and rural communities alike had been devastated, and the societal impact was profound. Entire families were wiped out, leaving children orphaned and economies struggling to recover from both the war and the disease. The Spanish flu highlighted the fragility of public health systems at a time when vaccines, antibiotics, and advanced medical care were unavailable. It demonstrated how quickly a virus could travel across continents in an increasingly interconnected world. Cities that responded quickly with social distancing, isolation of the sick, and closures of public spaces experienced dramatically lower mortality rates, showing the critical importance of proactive public health measures. Despite its global impact, the pandemic was largely forgotten for decades, overshadowed by World War I and the subsequent political and economic upheavals. Survivors carried immense grief, and communities struggled to process the trauma of losing a significant portion of their populations in such a short period. Yet the event left a lasting scientific legacy. It fueled research in virology, epidemiology, and immunology, leading to better understanding of influenza and more preparedness for future pandemics. The story of the Spanish flu serves as a chilling reminder of nature's power and the vulnerability of humanity. It killed more people in a single year than the Black Death killed in 4, yet it also taught vital lessons about prevention, preparedness, and the importance of global cooperation in public health. 100 years later, the pandemic continues to inform how societies respond to emerging viruses and how history can guide us in protecting millions of lives. In the summer of 1941, the largest invasion in human history was unleashed. Operation Barbarossa, the German assault on the Soviet Union, tore across the vast Eastern Front with shocking speed. Millions of soldiers moved relentlessly, capturing cities, towns, and villages, while the Soviet Union scrambled to respond. Amid the chaos, one city stood as both a symbol and a prize: Leningrad. Leningrad, today known as St. Petersburg, was far more than a population center. It was a city of history, industry, and pride, a cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution, and a vital hub for Soviet military production. Its shipyards maintained the Baltic Fleet, and its factories churned out weapons, tanks, and artillery. For the German High Command, capturing Leningrad was about both strategy and ideology. The city represented Soviet resilience and revolutionary spirit, and Hitler viewed it as a target that must be obliterated. As Army Group North advanced through the Baltic states, Soviet leadership knew time was slipping away. Citizens, men and women, old and young, were mobilized to defend their home. By midsummer, over 1 million civilians labored to build anti-tank ditches, fortifications, and barricades. Entire neighborhoods were converted into defensive positions, and factories shifted production from consumer goods to weapons of war. Despite the frantic defense, the German forces were relentless. By late July 1941, the Soviet troops managed to halt the Germans roughly 60 miles south of the city, buying precious time. But the reprieve was temporary. The German strategy was not to storm the city directly, it was to surround it, isolate it, and starve it into submission. Hitler's plan was chillingly simple and devastatingly effective. Cut off all supply routes, encircle the city with an iron ring of troops, and let hunger, disease, and the brutal Russian winter destroy the population. With this grim blueprint, the stage was set for what would become the longest siege in modern history, a trial of endurance and suffering unlike anything the world had ever seen. By August 1941, the German encirclement of Leningrad had tightened dramatically. Artillery shells began to rain down on vital infrastructure, cutting off electricity and destroying bridges. On August 29th, the town of MGA fell, severing the last operational railway connecting the city to the rest of the Soviet Union. With this, the Soviet supply lines were virtually gone, and panic began to spread among civilians and soldiers alike. On September 8, 1941, German troops reached the western shore of Lake Ladoga, completing the land encirclement. Nearly 3 million people were now trapped within the city limits. No reinforcements could arrive, no food convoys could enter, and the outside world could do little to help. The siege had officially begun. Just 2 days later, the German Air Force launched a massive bombing raid on the Barevsky warehouses, which stored the city's remaining reserves of flour, sugar, and other essential food supplies. Flames engulfed the stores, burning for hours and sending plumes of black smoke high into the sky. The warehouses were destroyed, leaving Leningrad with only what was on hand in households and small city stores. For most people, these supplies would last only a month, maybe 2, under the harsh conditions to come. The city faced a grim reality. Starvation was now the primary weapon of the enemy. With railways destroyed, roads under fire, and warehouses in ashes, all routes for obtaining food were severed. Civilians and soldiers alike braced for a winter unlike any they had ever known, where hunger and cold would become as deadly as bullets and bombs. By late September, rationing was introduced, but it barely made a difference. Authorities were forced to strictly control every gram of food. The daily bread ration was established as the main source of calories, yet even this meager sustenance would soon prove insufficient. The siege was no longer just a military operation, it was a deliberate campaign to break the city's spirit and its population through deprivation and fear. As autumn of 1941 faded into winter, the true horror of the siege revealed itself. Leningrad was no longer just a city under attack. It had become a battlefield, of survival, where civilians were the primary targets. By November, the municipal authorities implemented an official rationing system designed to stretch dwindling supplies, but even this was barely enough to sustain life. At the height of that first winter, manual laborers received only 250 grams of bread per day. Office workers and their families, along with children, were given as little as 125 grams, a single dense slice, barely enough to stave off starvation. The bread was not pure, it was adulterated with sawdust, cellulose, and other fillers to make it last longer. It provided less than 500 calories daily, far below the minimum needed to survive, especially in freezing conditions. Temperatures plummeted to minus 30 degrees Celsius, or minus 22 Fahrenheit, and with the city's heating system crippled, homes became death traps. Water pipes froze and burst, leaving many without access to drinking water. Desperate residents burned furniture, books, wooden floors, and even doors to stay warm. Entire buildings were dismantled for fuel. By January and February of 1942, the death toll soared. In these months alone, tens of thousands of civilians perished each week from starvation and cold. Corpses littered streets and homes. The sheer volume of death overwhelmed the few remaining burial teams. Families were forced to leave loved ones unburied, their bodies left where they fell. The scarcity of food and the extremity of conditions gave rise to horrifying acts of survival. Cannibalism, confirmed by police reports from the time, began to emerge among the most desperate. Ordinary citizens were confronted with impossible choices just to live another day. The city's population, once nearly 3 million, was slowly decimated, and the psychological toll on those who survived was immeasurable. Even as the city endured, the winter of 1941 to 1942 became infamous, not just for its temperatures, but for the relentless cruelty of a siege designed to break human will. Leningrad had become a city of shadows, its streets haunted by the living and the dead, as hunger and frost slowly claimed lives with terrifying regularity. By December of 1941, the frozen surface of Lake Ladoga offered a slim but vital chance for survival. With the city completely encircled and food reserves dwindling dangerously, Soviet engineers and planners created a daring supply route across the ice. This lifeline, quickly dubbed the Road of Life, became the only way to bring essential provisions into Leningrad and evacuate civilians from certain death. Convoys of trucks began crossing the treacherous frozen lake, braving bitter cold, shifting ice, and constant attacks from German artillery and aircraft. Temperatures often dropped below minus 30 degrees Celsius or minus 22 Fahrenheit, and the icy surface could crack without warning. Many vehicles, along with the courageous drivers, were lost when the ice gave way, plunging them into the freezing water below. Despite these dangers, the road provided a fragile yet crucial lifeline to the starving city. The Road of Life never delivered enough supplies to fully sustain Leningrad, but it allowed for modest increases in rations. By February 1942, the daily bread allocation rose slightly, providing just enough nutrition to keep the weakest alive. Even more importantly, it enabled the evacuation of more than 1 million people, primarily women, children, and the elderly. These evacuations saved countless lives that would otherwise have been lost to starvation, cold, or disease. The operation was remarkable not only for its scale, but for the extraordinary resilience of those involved. Drivers worked in shifts that often lasted for days, knowing that their cargo, meager sacks of flour, sugar, and potatoes, represented the only hope for survival. At the same time, icebreakers and Soviet military units worked tirelessly to maintain the route, ensuring it remained passable despite German bombardment and unpredictable weather conditions. While it was far from a complete solution, the Road of Life symbolized the determination and ingenuity of both the Soviet military and the citizens of Leningrad. It demonstrated that even in the darkest moments, hope could survive, and human effort could make the difference between life and death. It was a fragile thread connecting the besieged city to the outside world, a reminder that Leningrad, though starving and frozen, had not yet surrendered. By 1943, the tide of war on the Eastern Front was slowly beginning to shift. After more than a year of relentless siege, the German forces had failed to completely subdue Leningrad, and the Soviet High Command was ready to take decisive action. The first major breakthrough came in January 1943 with Operation Iskra, meaning spark. The goal of Operation Iskra was to open a narrow land corridor south of Lake Ladoga, piercing the German blockade and allowing larger, safer supplies to reach the city. Soviet troops from the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts attacked simultaneously from west and east, supported by massive artillery barrages. After 7 days of intense and bloody fighting, the two fronts met on January 18th, creating a corridor roughly 8 to 11 kilometers wide. The siege was not completely lifted, but for the first time in over 15 months, the city had a reliable supply route. Trains could bring in food and equipment, reducing dependence on the perilous road of life. The siege would finally be fully broken 1 year later. In January 1944, the Soviet forces launched a major offensive against Army Group North. After 2 weeks of relentless fighting, the German lines were pushed back, and on January 27, 1944, Leningrad was officially liberated. The city had endured 872 days of starvation, cold, and bombardment. The human cost was staggering. Before the war, Leningrad had nearly 3 million residents. By the end of the siege, only about 600,000 remained. Civilian deaths are estimated at between 800,000 and over 1 million, mostly from starvation, while military casualties add hundreds of thousands more. Combined, the total number of lives lost may have reached 1.5 million. Leningrad's suffering remains one of the deadliest episodes in modern history. Yet amidst the devastation, the city's story is also one of extraordinary resilience. Citizens continued to work, study, and create under unimaginable conditions. Musicians performed symphonies in freezing halls, scientists safeguarded priceless collections, and ordinary people dug through rubble, salvaged fuel, and endured extreme hunger without surrendering. The Siege of Leningrad is remembered not only for its staggering tragedy, but also as a testament to human endurance and the unbreakable spirit of a city determined to survive.